Hey guys, Dan here, welcome to this video. So I managed to get a 3080 and a 3090 on launch day. I just ordered them in an online store and managed to pick both cards up when they came out. So I guess supply in Germany was not that big of an issue compared to the rest of the world, it seems. And I wanted to put these two cards through some benchmarks in sim racing, especially iRacing, since that's the game that I play the most, but also ACC and F1 2020. But before we get to that, I'm streaming on Twitch every Tuesday, Wednesday and Friday. We do mostly sim racing there, sometimes a little bit of 3D printing, 3D modeling. Just got into that. We just did this dashboard here that you can see on top of the wheel. You actually can't see it, but well, we did it on stream. So maybe you want to tune in. Link is in the description below. Say hi. Would love to see you there. Okay, back to the benchmarks. We are doing this on my gaming PC, which is Intel i9 10900K. 32 gigabytes of RAM at 3600 megahertz, and well, the 3080 is a MSI Aventus and the 3090 is a Asus TUF. Later in the video we'll also compare it to a Ryzen 3900X, but yeah. We're going to test this in 6 different resolutions, the most common resolutions that are being used in sim racing. That is 1080p single screen, 1440p single screen, and then the same for ultra wide and for triple screens. And as you can see in this graph, 1440p triples actually pushes the graphic cards to the max. When you see those benchmarks in 4K and people are like, oh my god, 4K gaming, it's 8.3 million pixels, but 1440p triple screens are actually 11 million pixels. So that's nearly 3 million pixels more to push, and more than 5 times as many pixels as a 1080p single screen, for example. Okay, so first benchmark, we will start with F1 2020. The graphics are maxed out. I had the deep learning super sampling enabled because that's an RTX feature that probably should be enabled. And it also, it's great. It looks great and it gives a nice boost in performance. So what we did here is we went to the benchmark mode and just did a start at Melbourne and benchmark the first 40 seconds of the race. Okay, so here's the graph for the 6 different resolutions. Purple is the 2080 Ti, orange is the 3080, and blue is the 3090. It's honestly nothing really surprising. That is about the gaps that I expected from the cards. Something that is a little bit weird here is that the 2080 Ti is kind of a little bit weak in lower resolutions. If you look at 1080p single screen versus 1440p single screen, it's the same frame rate. I redid the benchmarks, but got the same results. But in the end, this is all playable frame rates. I mean, look at the 3090 at 1440p triples, you still get 115 frames per second at the scenario that's the hardest for the GPU, the start. But yeah, let's move on to some proper sim racing. Next benchmark will be ACC, and this game, I had so many crashes while trying to benchmark it. I actually was happy to uninstall it just after all the benchmarks were done, and yeah. If you watch my stream, you know my issues with ACC. So I tried to do the benchmarks in the Epic preset, but this game is so demanding. Even on the 3090 in the Epic preset, you get like 45 frames per second. So I thought this is not a very realistic scenario. But yeah, so we went with the high preset for the graphic settings. And I did 1 lap around Zandvoort and captured the first 40 seconds of that again. To make it reproducible, everything was recorded in the replay mode. So I recorded the race, saved the replay, went into the replay mode, and then did the benchmarks with this replay file. Okay, when we look at the data, you can see in the lower 3 resolutions here, that is the single screens and the 1080p ultra wide, we seem to be CPU limited. It's basically the same frame rate and also the same frame rate on all GPUs. And then the more pixels you push, the bigger the difference between the cards get. So at 1080p triples, you see there's already a difference, and with more pixels to push, like in 1440p ultra wide and then 1440p triples, the differences get even bigger. Something that's a bit surprising here is the gap between the 3080 and the 3090. It's, to be honest, a little bigger than expected, for example, for 1440p ultra wide, but yeah. In the end, this is really a game that is super demanding. I think we should not do like, can it run Crysis? I think we should do, can it run ACC in 1440p triples on the Epic preset, because the 3090 can't run that properly. It's the optimization, yeah, let's not talk about it. Okay, let's go on to iRacing. Again, I recorded a replay and then played that on the different graphics cards to get comparable results. Graphics are absolutely maxed out to the limit. Even motion blur was enabled, stuff like that. That cost a lot of performance because I wanted to see how how bad can the FPS get, and can you actually play it with a 3090 when you have like everything maxed out? We actually did the first benchmark on stream, so I swapped the 2080 Ti with the 3080 and the 3090 live. Kind of made myself look a little bit like an idiot, because if you do stuff like that on stream, it's always like, it's complicated. But yeah, we did a benchmark in the start at Monza, and if you watch this graph, you can see the 3080 is about 35% faster than the 2080 Ti, and the 3090 is another 20-ish% faster than that. So these gaps are actually bigger than I thought. They were done on 1440p triples, but I went more into detail off stream and did several benchmarks with different resolutions and different scenarios. And I wish everything was as easy as this Monza benchmark. So let's go to the first in detail scenario, that is start at Sebring, lap 1. The first 40 seconds again, and the results were kind of like, I don't even know what to say about it, because it's hard to understand. For example, 1080p and 1440p gets the same frame rates on all the three cards. Like if you compare 1080p triple screen to 1440p triple screen, RTX 3090, 86 frames per second. So like the pixel count doesn't really have an influence. Then you would think, okay, maybe we are CPU limited. But then if you go to 1080p single and you have like nearly twice the frame rate, I don't really know what to make out of this. But something I learned from the benchmarks for iRacing is that iRacing is highly dependent on the FOV. So the wider the FOV, the lower is your frame rate. And you also probably noticed that we now have 8 resolutions, because 1080p ultrawide T and 1440p ultrawide T got added here. That is just the ultrawide rendered as triple screens. Some people with the ultrawide render their screen as virtual triples and put in an angle of like 15 degrees to account for the curve of the monitor. And this actually costs quite some performance in a scenario like this. But let's get to a more realistic scenario that is like mid-race, where you will probably be like 95% of the time, unless you always wreck on lap 1, which is not super unlikely, but... So I did the same benchmark just in this race, but lap 22. And the graph looks like this, much higher frame rate obviously, and the gap between the cards actually is much bigger now. For example, if you look at the 1440p figures, 115 frames per second on the 3090 compared to 86 on the 2080 Ti. Something that is a little bit weird here for the 3000 series is that 1440p single screen actually gets more frames per second than the 1080p single screen. Again, I redid those benchmarks, but got the same results, but whatever. And as the last scenario for iRacing, I went with something that should not stress the CPU a lot. I went with an oval track and just had 6 cars on it. And if we look at the graph, it looks like this. And again, it's something I can't really explain, to be honest. For example, 1440p triples, the 3080 and the 3090 are nearly as fast. Whereas on 1080p ultrawide, for example, there is a difference of about 14% between the cards. Look at the numbers, see what you want to get out of these graphs and make up your mind yourself, I would say. In the end, it's super hard to draw a conclusion or make any recommendations for the new cards. It's so dependent on the track and the car and your settings and your resolution. For example, the same settings on one track, I see like a 10% gap between the 2080 Ti and the 3090. On another track, there's like a 60% gap with everything else being the same, so the only variable being the track. It's weird on iRacing, I have to say. But before we end the video, I have another bonus benchmark here where I compared the 10900K and the Ryzen 3900X with the 3080. So the same Sebring start replay, you can see that actually the Intel is about 15 to 20% faster than the Ryzen, and iRacing is still heavily dependent on the single-threaded performance from the CPU. For example, the Ryzen with a 3080 is slower than the Intel with a 2080 Ti. Similar picture, lap 22. Only difference here that actually the Ryzen wins one scenario by like 2 frames per second. That is 1440p triples. But overall, still get a much better performance with the Intel system. So to wrap this up, if you mainly play iRacing, and you have a Ryzen and a 2080 Ti, maybe it's better to invest into Intel CPU instead of getting the 3080, because the boost you will get from going from the 3900X to the 10900 or 10850K will be bigger in most scenarios than if you would upgrade from the 2080 Ti to the 3080. But I have to say, next week AMD will announce new processors and the first leaks look very promising. So I will try to get a 5900X early to see how it performs on iRacing, and hopefully I can share the benchmarks here on the channel as well. But yeah guys, that's it for the video. Leave a comment down below if you would love to see more of this tech and benchmark stuff, or what other data you would love to see from the new cards. I still have all the 3 cards here. I'm probably going to keep the 3090 for the gaming PC and put the 3080 into the streaming PC, which will be super overkill. But whatever. If you liked the video, maybe click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.